Welcome back to another exciting episode of Chronicling the Crimes of the Criminal Cartel. And who better to talk to about those crimes today than Jeff Nielsen from Bullion Bulls Canada. Jeff, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to chat, John.
Always a pleasure to chat with you. Say, people are hungry for real information, and I know you have some very specific things you want to talk about today. Let me read you this, though, first, from Dennis Gartman, who wrote in the New York Times just recently, and I quote, "We've traded gold for nearly 4 decades, and we've never, ever seen anything like what we've witnessed in the past 2 trading sessions." Jeffy goes on to say, this is an orchestration, the smash in gold in parentheses. It's been going on now from the beginning of April. He goes on to say, it's an act of desperation because they've got to establish in people's minds that the dollar is the only safe place. It is the only safe haven, not gold, not silver, and not other currencies. And what he's saying, Jeff, is because if they don't get people to believe that, the bond market will blow up, the stock market will blow up, and the banks that are too big to fail will fail. Jeff, what we're seeing is just absolutely epic. And what I love about this, you and I talked about this for about 5 seconds before we recorded this call here, is that people are hungry for real information. And I'm just glad that you can help us cut through the lies.
Well, you know, it's one of those situations where, of course, you can't see what's going on exactly as it happens. So when the slaughter first began, you know, I was sort of, you know, scrambling for clues just like everybody else. But now, as the dust is settling just the tiniest bit, we begin to see some definite patterns in the facts and some sort of clear picture taking form. And let me just say that, you know, I totally agree with the material you quoted. I'm just utterly astounded at the source. That it's coming from somebody like Dennis Gartman, who certainly has not been candid in this manner with his comments in the past.
That's a great point, Jeff. He actually says, I should have read that entire paragraph. I'll read the beginning of it because I didn't read that for you. He says, quote, "The exchange value of the dollar is being threatened, and if that collapses, the Fed loses control over interest rates." And then he goes on to say what I read, the bond market blows up, stocks blow up, the banks fail. As you know, Jeff, the point is that this paper Ponzi is failing and it's coming apart at the seams, and just about everybody knows it.
Well, but of course, what we're seeing now is that things were in fact telegraphed in advance. And so looking back in hindsight, we can now see the pattern formed. And, you know, for me, the first clue, of course, was that this price slaughter is entirely derived from a collapse in paper holdings. And, of course, the significance of that is that, you know, the paper market rules the physical market. We all know that. It's, of course, 100 times larger, as Jeffrey Christian tells us, and anything that's 100 times larger is going to dominate something 100 times smaller. So we're seeing a liquidation in the paper market. Of course, what the mainstream media is trying to pretend is that this simply is a flight out of gold, quote unquote. But of course, what it really is a flight out of paper gold.
You're right. There's a flight out of paper gold. We can see what's going on here. They're throwing billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of ounces of paper metal at the market to drive these prices lower. And meanwhile, they're draining the COMEX of inventories. What does that tell you? We're seeing the largest drain on COMEX inventories ever recorded.
Well, that's the whole thing. Let me back up a bit to what you said about the bankers dumping massive quantities of gold onto the market. They don't need to. Not this time. This is the only time they don't need to do that because, of course, the liquidation of paper gold, you know, liquidating long positions and going short, I mean, those are just two sides of the same coin. So this liquidation of paper gold all by itself creates a downward pressure. You know, if people bail out of any market, you know, even legitimate markets, price goes down. That's inevitable. So this liquidation must cause a price crash. And so the bankers, all they're doing is goosing the downward pressure and, of course, amplifying the hype with the propaganda machine. But the liquidation itself is what's causing this downward movement. And, of course, this brings us to the real issue here, the motivation for the liquidation. And that, of course, is also crystal clear in hindsight. It's the Cyprus deal. And, of course, here's where things get you know, incredibly obvious, you know, once we all sort of sit back and think about this for a second. We were all expecting paper holders to slowly figure out that none of their paper is safe and to move out of those markets. Now, if you look at the entire realm of paper holders, what's the one group out of all those paper holders you would expect to figure this out first and move first? Well, obviously, it's the paper gold holders, and that's what we've seen.
Well, let's go back to this Cyprus steal. What are you hearing about the Cyprus theft? What do you think was behind that specifically, Jeff?
Well, of course, what we got from the propaganda machine was all this stuff about how a precedent has been set. So now, of course, taking money out of bank accounts is legitimate because it's been done before. And, lo and behold, we look around and all of our governments have quietly snuck all of these rules in place to do the mechanism, and now we have the precedent. So, of course, the fact is that this is now a realistic threat in any and every Western regime. But, of course, what we heard rumored at this time, and what seems to have been, borne out after the fact, is that much of the big money in those Cyprus bank accounts was moved out weeks prior to the event taking place, which, of course, conclusively indicates that the big money was tipped off in advance of what was going to happen, and they already had made their move before the Cyprus deal took place. And, of course, this is what makes the collapse in COMEX gold inventories particularly significant because it began well before the Cyprus deal. So what we're seeing here is another example of big money tipped off in advance and already beginning their move, well before the script actually ever came out to reach the little people and events started taking place publicly.
So we saw premeditation in Cyprus, premeditated crime. We're also seeing premeditated future crime in Canada because isn't there some legislation that's been just written in allowing for bail-ins in the future for the too big to fail banks?
Well, in Canada, it's gone beyond policy papers. Our government has formally drafted this into our budget. And so, in fact, if anything, Canada has carved this in stone more than any other Western government. And naturally, as a Canadian, my big fear is that this means that Canada is next in line right behind Cyprus. And along those lines, of course, it was only a few days ago I wrote my own commentary entitled Stephen Harper's Cyprus Blueprint for Canada, because what I'd already found out, thanks to being tipped off by readers who were alerting to this, is that our government in Canada went and duplicated the U.S. housing bubble in terms of the structure of our housing market and the financial sector. And, of course, it did so, this Harper government, after the U.S. bubble had already burst. So, of course, this isn't simply a premeditated construction of a bubble. This is a premeditated construction of an implosion. And so now, unlike the U.S., when you had your housing bubble blow up, we've got a housing bubble that's about to blow up and bail-in rules now in place. And so that was what really, really struck me and made me, become very emphatic in my commentaries recently.
Yeah, and, for those who may not know the history, too, Scotia-Mocatta is the biggest bullion bank up there in Canada. We know our good friend Harvey Organ and his son had tremendous trouble getting delivery of their physical silver and gold from Scotia-Mocatta. That was a gigantic story. There are many reports of Scotiabank and Scotia-Mocatta's connection to malfeasance and some shenanigans that went on 9/11. I think that all of this is much bigger than people can imagine. To see Canada, where the banks are really, I think for all practical purposes, in much better shape than the banks are here in the United States, to see Canada make this preemptive strike for future bailouts for these banks is really a five-alarm fire.
Well, of course, Canada's banks were in far better shape, and this is totally past tense, because from the moment Stephen Harper got into power, he has been relentlessly deregulating the banking industry and cranking up the leverage, along with, of course, his buddy Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of Canada. So, this has been pedal to the metal since these people got into power. Create a housing bubble, deregulate the financial industry, crank up the leverage. It would have been impossible to create any basis for stealing money to give to Canadian banks even 5 years ago, because nothing could have made them need the money. But, of course, now the scenario has been created. The intentional insolvency in this system has been created so that all it requires is detonation, and then we can have our own massive steal. And then, of course, what everybody who thinks the Canadian financial system is safe is going to find out is that, presto, we've got our own Ponzi scheme. Stephen Harper's been busy, and he's, followed the example of his American masters very closely.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you use the word detonation. What they are planning is a controlled demolition of, I think, really the world banking system, at least the Western banking system, and probably the world economy. And apparently it's all by design. I guess that comes as no surprise to most of our listeners. Why don't we talk a little bit about what you've been writing about just even today, is that there's a growing discount in the unit price of paper products, silver and gold products, which may herald, as you write, a decoupling between the real market and the paper fraud market. That's interesting because I'm starting to see it too. I mean, we're seeing huge premiums on Silver Eagles and Canadian Maples.
Well, and of course, there's two dimensions of this news item. To begin with, it reinforces the suspicion that this is a massive flight out of paper and into physical bullion. Because, of course, supply and demand pressures. If demand for paper is crumbling and demand for physical is increasing, we're going to see a spread in price for the two different forms of quote-unquote gold. So this larger discount on the paper units, the increasing premium on the physical units is, again, further strong circumstantial evidence of the flight out of paper and into physical. But then, of course, what I've been talking about on our site for a long time now is that, rather than an out-and-out default event in bullion markets, what will very likely happen when that the fraud just simply implodes upon itself is that we won't see a formal default event which would reveal everything and expose the criminals, but instead we'll see some massive smokescreen, some massive fraudulent crash created, and then out of that rubble there's going to be a disconnect between the paper market and the physical market, a decoupling of prices, and we'll have probably for some very short period of time this absurd world where there's literally a paper price that's in the news and a physical price for gold. And of course that decoupling will in turn be the heralding of the end of the paper market altogether.
Well, Jeff, let me tell you this. This is really interesting, and I want to see what your thoughts are on this. Do you follow the work of Cliff High at all with the WebBots project?
No, I'm sorry, that name doesn't ring a bell.
Oh, okay. Well, a lot of the folks who follow SGT Report and all the alt media sites are familiar with the WebBots project. And a guy by the name of Cliff High and George Ure designed these bots originally for profiting from the stock market, but they've since been used for the benefit of humanity to a large degree, I think is what Cliff would say. The reason I bring this up is because in one of his, he calls them Woojos, essentially a podcast. In his most recent Woojo on the 14th, Cliff's, you can do a search on this for Cliff's Woojo, and it'll come up. And listen to the one he did on the 14th, in which he predicts the volatility and essentially the end of empire, the collapse of the banking system that we're seeing with the raid in gold and silver on Friday and then again on Monday. He predicted that within the next couple of days, Tuesday or Wednesday, and he said this on the 14th, he said, some overreaction by the powers that be will take place, and it'll be yet another sign of their desperation. And he wasn't sure what that would be. He saw he calls it language. The WebBots are indicating language. And the language would be something very dire, very actionable. We'd know what it is when we see it. He threw out a couple examples. One of the examples was a hike in margins on silver and gold. So he recorded this Woojo, this podcast, on the 14th, which I believe was Sunday. Now, Jeff, didn't the CME raise rates on gold and silver by 18% on Monday, the 15th?
That's right. Basically, right after the markets close, they came out and made their move, which is, basically standard procedure. They don't want to make these changes, of course, during an actual trading session. That just creates further chaos and raises questions. So they do it right after the markets close to give, of course, the maximum amount of time for the psychological impact to sink in before the next day's trading session begins.
Yeah, well, the reason I bring this up, I just listened to that Woojo last night, and I found it really stunning because, of course, I was listening in the past tense, and I knew what had happened since he made that prediction. And, the reason I bring it up is because he also, the WebBots, had also made the prediction of very unusually cold climate and a very unusually cold spring, which is, of course, what we've had in the Midwest where I live. It's been the coldest, worst spring we've seen in literally 50 years. And he's calling for this global coastal event. But what he's also been talking about for a very, very long time is silver and gold decoupling from the paper price finally and trading freely, and he's seeing $10,000, $15,000 gold prices and $500+ silver prices, and ultimately silver really vaulting much higher to trade briefly 1-to-1 and even better than 1-to-1 with gold. And I bring that all up again. We've talked about it a few times here at SGT Report. I've talked about it in some of the things I've done. Again, sometimes Cliff is wrong, but sometimes he's right. Sometimes those web bots are dead on. And in this case, I can see the case for $500 silver, Jeff, because this paper Ponzi is now visible to anyone paying attention, and the house of cards is finally starting to collapse. It literally is collapsing before our eyes.
Well, and of course, what you described with this gentleman is a numbers guy, somebody who understands numerical relationships and then simply applies that understanding in an objective manner to kick out results. And of course, I'm sure your audience has read or heard me make very similar predictions with regard to, the evolution of these markets and prices of this market. Because, of course, we talk about fundamentals and that being a matter of economics, but what it really gets down to is this is an interaction of arithmetic. These are hard commodities where there are real relationships in place. It costs a certain amount of money to dig this ore out of the ground and refine it, process it, ship it. And of course, there are consequences to any perversion of prices beyond equilibrium values, and that can never be prevented. And all that can be affected by the criminals with their manipulation is they can delay the correction, and of course, in delaying the correction, they will produce an even more extreme reaction. So we won't have the pendulum simply swinging back to an equilibrium, but in fact it must swing back much more violently past the equilibrium point, and then of course start to stabilize again in the middle.
Isn't it funny to think that we are really living through some of the most incredible history ever seen on planet Earth? I mean, right now we are living through the Internet age, some would say a great awakening, and hopefully the death of the evil empire. I mean, with any luck, the death of this criminal banking system.
And, with every episode they inflict upon us, they toughen us up that much more for the next one. Ultimately what they're doing with us little people is forging steel.
We will persevere. I mean, we have no other choice. We can either stand up and stand strong and stand for liberty and stand for truth and, stand for future generations, or we can become slaves. Okay, brother. Well, thanks so much for your time. And why don't you give people a shout? Why don't you remind people where they can find your great work? In addition to being at SGT Report every day, how do they find you on the Internet over at your great site?
Sure. My site is bullionbullscanada.com.
All right, guys. Jeff Nielsen from bullionbullscanada.com. Thank you, Jeff. We sure appreciate it.
Thanks again, Sean.
All right, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
You too, man. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.